Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our monthly Wiltshire Branch webinar. My name is Keith Turner, and I'll be co-hosting the session this evening. I'm just going to wait for a few more minutes for other attendees to join us, and then we'll be starting. So welcome again, everyone, to our monthly Wiltshire Branch webinar. This month's session is on the topic of technology at home, something that I'm sure is highly relevant to many of us, especially during the ongoing pandemic. My name is Keith Turner, and together with my colleague Jeff Hunt, we'll be hosting this evening's event. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate today. Note that this event is being recorded. If you do not wish to attend a recorded event, please disconnect now. As this is a webinar, your mic will remain muted and your webcam disconnected during the event. The event duration will be no longer than 1 hour. If you have questions, please submit these by using the QA function in your Zoom control panel and directing your question to my co-host, Jeff Hunt. We will collate these questions and address them to our panelist at the end of this evening's event. If a question that you wish to ask has already been submitted, you may use the upvote option to register your interest. I would now like to introduce our panelist today, Colin Butcher. Colin is a consultant engineer who's led the design and implementation of mission-critical and disaster-tolerant systems in a wide range of industries. As a consulting engineer, he's been working from home office for the past 25 years or so. Colin, a very warm welcome, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Well, hello everybody, and thank you for coming along to this. This fell out of an idea that I was discussing with some of the Wiltshire Branch committee a few weeks back, and we decided it would be worth talking through the technology of working from home. I've also ended up helping various friends and neighbours and relatives with this stuff, as indeed I'm sure many of you have been doing with helping other people. So it's probably worth a quick sort of refresher on just how it all hangs together and works and how we connect back to work and some of the other pitfalls about working from home. So, as Keith has just said, I've had an office at home for the last nearly 25 years, and I've done lots of collaborative remote working on systems around the world from here. Usually, I prefer to travel because if you're doing teaching and mentoring and helping others, I find it better to be with them than not. But certainly of late, we've ended up having to work this way, and we've all learned quite a few things. And we've been able to adapt, and some of those ideas might pop out along the way and perhaps help people. So we're trying to encourage people to just make a bit more effort to understand how things work about the working from home technology. My background's been the sort of really big stuff, so air traffic control systems, finance industry. The thing I've done of late, which was probably the last big project I'll take on, is stuff that runs the blood core systems that run the blood transfusion service, which has actually been really important because it's been very helpful with things like all the plasma and so on and so on and so on during the pandemic. And it's been a very interesting group of people to work with who are all trying really hard to do a really good job. So it's been really quite satisfying getting involved with that level of thing. So, as has already been alluded to, the way we've all had to adapt has been a massive shift in the way a lot of people work. A lot of this has been driven by the pandemic. Some of it's been driven by cost, some of it's been driven by all sorts of other things. There's been such a huge shift over the last year and a half. And remote working is definitely here to stay. It used to be more the sort of province of people who traveled a lot and were doing mobile working. Whereas now it's not mobile, it's home. There is a subtle difference there that's worth understanding. And that comes out in the way that the data links work. And the other thing is we're all now horribly reliant on this stuff. The whole IT thing has gone mass market. Everybody has stuff at home. Everybody's expected to know how it works. Everybody's expected to just be able to use it. And that isn't always true, unfortunately. And I think as an industry, quite a lot of this stuff could be better done to help others. but there's definitely a need for a bit more understanding, if only to be able to ask better questions or explain the problem you've hit more easily. The other thing that's happened is the way that people behave. So if you're working from home, the distinction between what I'd call work and non-work is less clear than it used to be. That can be a good thing. The working hours can become a lot more fluid. You can pick stuff up and put it down again when you're able to, within reason. Has some other interesting twists and turns. So it's quite possible for people to become a lot more lax, the way they dress, the way they talk, the way they will interact with others. And some of that's driven by there's less social interaction because you're not meeting people as much on a regular basis. And there's been a big shift in the way that people communicate. I've started hearing people say things like, oh yes, I've spoken to him or her. And what they really mean is, actually, I've sent them an email and I've had an exchange of email, or I've had an exchange of text messages. And that isn't actually speaking, but the way the word's being used is starting to shift. Personally, I'm still a big fan of using the phone, or if you can, meeting people in person. I think you get a better level of communication. The electronic stuff I find works if you know the people really well. But if you don't know the people terribly well, I find it a bit more difficult. Now, there used to be a fashion for something called bring your own device, BYOD. So there's a bit of a joke on that. I decided to describe this as BYON. So we're not just bringing our own device to work, we're bringing our entire network at home to work. That's a very different thing. So it's all about the quality of the connection. And there are two connections that really matter. One of them is from wherever you are to the internet. So that's going to be your broadband connection. It might be mobile data. But that's your internet supplier, internet provider's connection to the outside world. And the other is your connection within the building. So how is the device you're using, be it a phone, a tablet, a laptop, a desktop PC, whatever, connected to the router or hub, as some of the providers call them, that is then attached to the internet connection. And it's important to understand that there's a difference. I hear people, some of the neighbors have just talked about, oh yes, my Wi-Fi is not working. Well, they didn't really mean that. What they really meant was that actually my broadband's not working very well, but I think it's my Wi-Fi. And there isn't quite the understanding of what the different pieces are. So that's one of the things I'd really like to help people understand better. And then the other thing that's going on here is who or what else is also using the connection at the same time. Big problem with all network traffic, and this is true for big data centers. It's something we worry about in really big data centers, is contention. Who else is trying to push data over the link at the same time as we are? Because that's going to potentially interfere with what we're doing. And so it's really important to understand more about that. And in a small village or in a row of houses or whatever, if everybody's using the same broadband supplier, that's not the people who send you the bill, by the way, that's the people who actually provide the wire into the building. So if everybody's reliant on a ultimately OpenReach BT piece of wire, it gets back to the cabinet and it then gets back further to an exchange. You are contending with your neighbors. So you do have to think a little bit about what you're doing and when you're doing it and who your provider is. And this is an oldie but a goodie. You generally get what you pay for. So the idea of this rather nice triangle is, and I've used this so many times and have other people, I don't know who came up with it first, but it's really good. Pick two, it's not going to be the third. And that's definitely true for a lot of the technology at home. Problem with a lot of technology at home is it wasn't really designed for working from home. And a lot of people would, unless they were running their own business from home or something, probably bought on price. So it may not be that great and it may not be that fast. If it's really fast and really good, it probably wasn't cheap, and that's probably not something that a lot of people would have invested in. but now they've been pushed into using it because of having to work from home, and they haven't quite got the infrastructure that they'd ideally like to give a really good result when you are working from home. So for me, it's about being seen to be professional. I would say this, wouldn't I? Because that's what I've been doing for the last umpteen years. But it's true now with people working from home. Your employer would like you to be, come across professionally. And so you are to some extent on your own when it comes to your connection and also looking after your own stuff. Unless your employer has provided you with a nice high bandwidth connection and has provided you with a nice high performance laptop and you only use it for work, etc. And if so, that's terrific. They've really thought about this and really helped you do a good job. But a lot of people have kind of fallen into doing this and are reliant on lots of bits of technology that aren't necessarily their responsibility or under their control. And so it's just slightly different. I've walked into that several times of late. Unfortunately, my mother died last year, so I've spent a lot of time trying to deal with organizations to tidy things up legally and so on as part of doing probate. And some of the organizations you deal with by phone are great, and some of them are definitely struggling to adapt to people working from home. And that's another of the motivations behind doing this kind of a talk. And the other thing is thinking about, at the bottom, is the other really important one, which is thinking about security, confidentiality, privacy, things like that. It's too easy to chuck stuff around by email without quite thinking what's going on. And this is another important part of it. Things will go wrong. It's usually not going to be convenient. So being reasonably minimalist and trying to avoid things that are complicated is generally worth doing. It also helps if you know enough about your stuff to at least be able to back it up and recover it in case you have a horrible disaster. But with help, and know who to ask for help, know where to go, but do make a bit of effort just to understand the terminology and things slightly better, and then you can improve your ability to describe the problem. Let me give a good example. I've got a really great friend, Gerald, who's now in his mid-80s. And every so often he'll phone up for help. That's terrific. The thing that's really, really, really great about him is that he used to be a pilot. In fact, he's had a license for over 60 years. I really admire him. And if you ask a question, he tells you exactly what's on the screen without adding or subtracting anything or adding any opinions. You get really clear information because as a pilot, he's used to having to provide good, clear information about what he can see in order that somebody else can tell him what to do real soon now, else things are going to go bad. And so that level of understanding that he needs to provide good, clear information, not, oh, hang on a minute, rattle, rattle, rattle of the keyboard in the background, is great. So just make a little bit of effort, please. So things to worry about with a connection at home. There's a diagram coming up in a mo that'll kind of show some of this. People talk about bandwidth. That's really, the size of the pipe, if you will. That's how much data can you push between where you are and where it's going to. So bandwidth is important. Latency is more important. So latency is the end-to-end delay before the data starts flowing. And it's often latency that kills you rather than bandwidth. The two are interrelated. There's a whole branch of mathematics, queuing theory, things like that devoted to it. So in general, more bandwidth, less contention. Less contention equals less things bumping into each other, equals less delays to the bits you're interested in. So there is a relationship between the two. The other thing that's really important is which way is the data going? So if you take broadband as it was designed, good old-fashioned ADSL over a telephone line, because it's asymmetric, you've got different data rates in different directions. So we might have a 10 meg or 100 meg connection inbound, but we might only have a half a meg or a 1 meg connection outbound. That's great if all you're doing is streaming video or downloading things. It is not great if you're doing voice calls and online meetings, especially with video turned on, because that needs to be bi-directional. So you need good upload bandwidth as well as good download bandwidth. So there are little bits of software out there. I think Ookla do a thing called speed test, and that can be really helpful to just show you the difference in performance. In general, if you've got a big bandwidth connection, you'll tend to get a lot more download. You'll tend to get much more upload, and usually you get slightly, but not necessarily, better latency. So understanding the direction of the flow is at least as important as understanding how much. And different connections work in different ways. So this is an attempt to show all the pieces that make up your data network at home. So top left, you've got the internet or your internet provider's network, and then beyond that is the internet. So you've got a box probably at home, which BT or Virgin Media or the others will call a hub and a super hub. And in there is hiding a whole load of different things. So you've got the external network endpoint, which is where the cable from the outside world plugs in. That might go through an intermediate thing called an optical network termination unit if you've got fiber to the home. I'm trying to keep this generic rather than talk about any specific provider, because the principles are what I'm trying to get across, not necessarily the specifics. Then you've got the router, which is the thing that turns things on the inside of your network as network addresses and manages the connection of each of those to the outside network. So each device on the inside has to go through this router function, the thing called NAT, network address translation, and that ends up on the outside. And then that's how data can flow back and forth. Then you usually have something called a firewall and a web filter. So that's keeping stuff out that you don't particularly want. And with a bit of luck, it's blocking access to websites that you don't want people to look at, or you don't want your kids to look at, or whatever. You've then got usually a 4-port network switch. There's a wired Ethernet switch hiding in there as well, to which you can wire up your desktop PC and things. And then there's usually a Wi-Fi access point buried in there too, and that serves Wi-Fi, and then that's how laptops, phones, tablets, and other things can connect. And that's not necessarily going to be able to work in a big building or an old building with thick walls, but it's terribly convenient because you don't have wires trailing all over the place. A word of advice: wired is always going to be better than Wi-Fi. It's dedicated to you, and it's faster, and it's much more secure, and it's less complicated to set up. So if you can use wired, desktop PC, wired to your router, straight to the outside world, it's going to generally do a better job than using Wi-Fi. But Wi-Fi is incredibly convenient, and that's why a lot of people use it. Now, your network at work, in a data center or in a computer room at the office or whatever, actually looks terribly similar. All you've got is a very shrunken version of this. There's your internet provider network, there's your external network endpoints, routers. Oh, a thing called VPNs come into play. I'll talk about those in a minute. Virtual private networks. Those can be your connection back into the office or work so that it looks as though you're inside the office. I'll explain what those do in a moment. You've got firewalls, you've got web filters, you've got network switches, you've got access points for Wi-Fi, you've got multiple what we call SSIDs, and I'll come on to that in a moment. It's very, very, very similar. So all you have at home is a really shrunken version of what you'd generally find at work. So your connection to the outside world is using this broadband stuff. If it's an old-fashioned telephone line, you've got ADSL filters. They're just low-pass and high-pass frequency filters. So the low-pass signal, I think can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, that goes to the telephone for voice, and the really high-frequency signals go to the hub, or the ADSL modem part of the hub, and that's the high-frequency data signals. So that's how two kinds of signals are passed over the same piece of copper back to the exchange. You might, if you're using Virgin Media, have fiber to the cabinet in the road, and then you're using copper coaxial cable into the premises. That's how I'm connected here. And then of late, there's been fibre into the premises, where you have an optical network termination unit in the building, and a piece of wire goes from that and then into the hub thing. Another way of being connected, if you don't have access to broadband where you live, or the broadband is very sluggish and you need better, is actually a little mobile data router. So it's kind of the equivalent of a mobile hotspot, but it's not mobile. You might choose to put it up in the roof space or somewhere, and you can get 4G or 5G data. The subtlety there is that most broadband is this asymmetric stuff, and most mobile data is a bit more symmetric. So if you really need loads of upload speed and you're in a not that great area for broadband, you might find that switching to a mobile data connection would do a better job. And this is what some companies are doing. They're giving their employees, you know, an armor-plated laptop for work, for security, and a separate 5G or 4G mobile data router. And that's their setup for working from home. And they're not supposed to use it for anything other than that. And they're not supposed to use their home stuff for anything to do with work. And that's, if you're in a relatively secure business, that's a pretty sensible way of doing things. So your connection to this hub at home is wired Ethernet. It might be gigabit or 100 megabit Ethernet, or it might be Wi-Fi. And as I've said before, wired is faster, simpler, more secure. Wi-Fi is really dependent. And often, if you're trying to do things, you might need signal boosters scattered around the place. Better is to use multiple access points. It costs more. It goes back to the triangle diagram again. And you can create a Wi-Fi mesh. That's what I happen to have done here, because we live in a very old house with very thick walls, and the signal doesn't make it through the walls. And that's for a really good reason. There's a bit of terminology that we need to think about. So the SSID is the network name that you connect to. You can hide those if you want to improve security. And this is just setting up Wi-Fi off a laptop, say, to talk to your router or off a phone. And you'll want a password to be able to connect. And that's using a wireless privacy access version 2. And then, as I said, multiple access points can form this mesh with roaming. What that means is, as you move around the building, the connection will stay up, because the link between your mobile device, you know, the laptop, the phone, the tablet, and the access points is handed off from one access point to another as you move around. And that's quite neat. And that's coming out of big system stuff that was done 10, 15 years ago by companies like Cisco and Meraki and some of the others. This is something that's worth knowing about. Wi-Fi, as with cell phone, the frequency bands are very low power microwave. And so it's easily absorbed by water vapor or water molecules. So if you've got big, thick walls in an old house, they're probably a bit damp, and the signal's not going to go very far. Might explain why, if you're in areas of poor mobile reception, have you ever noticed that it gets worse when it's raining? This is why, you know, the signal's being absorbed by the raindrops. You're doing a great job of heating up the rain, and so you're losing signal strength. It's the same thing here. The other thing about Wi-Fi is bandwidth is shared by all devices using the same access point. So contention can be a problem. You know, if you've got somebody in the room next door or elsewhere in the house, and they're downloading a huge amount of stuff or streaming video or whatever, there you are contending with them for access to the outside world. So if you're trying to do an online meeting at the same time as a couple of people in the house are trying to watch Netflix, that might be a large part of your problem, just the local Wi-Fi stuff, let alone what they're doing to the connection to the outside world between your router and the internet. You can try using range extenders and boosters for signal propagation, but in general, multiple access points will do a better job. That usually means running a bit of wire in order to get the access points connected up, things like that. So it's largely down to how far you want to go and how big your building is and all sorts of fun things like that. VPNs. So this is what a VPN does. So a virtual private network would allow me, for example, with my laptop, to connect back to my office at home, or it would allow you sat at home with your work laptop or your laptop connected to work, to connect securely to work and operate as though you're part of the network at work. So one of our neighbors was asking about this. I ended up describing it as a hose pipe. So you've got this long, thin hose pipe that sort of reaches from your PC, the VPN client, out through the internet and into a VPN server at the office. And you have to authenticate who you are. So you have one of those little magic number generator things on your phone, or you've got a little RSA key fob, and that makes sure you're connected to the right place at the far end. And then from there on, it's just as though you're at the office, except you're on a long dangly umbilical through the internet that, depending on the connection properties, may have a bit more latency and not as much bandwidth. But most things will probably work. But, you know, printing, for example, you can send stuff to the printer at work if you like, but that's not necessarily going to help too much unless there's somebody there to post it to you, or you go in to pick it up. So you might want to talk to a local printer for printing, for example, things like that. So that's what a VPN does. That's some of the terminology, and that's kind of how it works. Then there's this authentication thing. Common problems that we all hit when we're doing working from home: poor voice quality, out of sync video, other things happening. So, you know, one of my bugbears is all the automated updates. In fact, did anybody else get bitten by this? I did. Microsoft released an auto update of Outlook a few days back, might be a week or so ago, and it had a bug in it, and loads of people couldn't look at their email for a few hours. And there was a lot of row worldwide on various chat forums trying to guess what had happened. And then a fix came out for it within 24 hours. And everything was there. But not only is that disruptive to your work, that the actual software being downloaded, or the Windows updates being downloaded, or the MacBook updates being downloaded, all of those things are chewing up the link out with your control, and they might be happening at the same time as you're trying to have an online meeting. So, you know, 7 o'clock of an evening, it could be that a whole load of PCs are scheduled to go away and do automatic updates because it's the end of the working day. Or indeed, your company might have set them up to automatically back up the data on the PC at the end of the day. All sorts of things like that. And it's burning up the bandwidth. And that's why doing something else at the same time, you might suddenly get not that great communication quality. So voice and video, video particularly, really does need good and consistent latencies. This is where the delays are pretty low and pretty consistent. I don't know about you, I've had some horrible voice calls. There was one outfit I was dealing with in Edinburgh. We were trying to sell my mother's house. And I have no idea how they'd set things up with people working from home. But there was close on a half a second lag in the conversations. So you had to speak really very slowly and very carefully, and then leave a huge pause at the end of each sentence for the person at the other end to reply. And it was just really frustrating. You could kind of cope with it once you realize what was going on, but it was terrible. We ended up using cell phones instead because they don't suffer from the same problem because they work with different technology. Voice and video, as I said earlier, it does need good bidirectional bandwidth. And if you've got poor voice quality and not that great video, just try knocking the video off. You will use less bandwidth, which is a good thing. And it may just give you better latency as well, because with less traffic flowing, statistically, the probability of contention is a bit lower, and it might just improve enough to be more workable for you. But the old-fashioned landline phone or cell phone may just be a better solution. There are quite a lot of trade-offs as well that are going on in various places. So pieces of software such as we're using now, Zoom, GoToMeeting, Teams, WebEx, etc. They all do lots and lots and lots of processing at both ends to try and reduce the traffic on the link to the internet. So there's lots of compression going on and things like that to try and reduce the amount of data on the link, therefore to try and reduce the amount of contention, therefore to stop the latency getting worse. And there are other things you can do. For example, I don't know, with Zoom, you can turn on things like blurred backgrounds, and that's loads of extra local processing. And that, if your computer isn't up to the extra workload, can also produce stuttering and things within the video stream. So if you're using any of the fancy backgrounds, it might be worth trying to turn those off and make sure your shelves are tidy or full of interesting books or whatever. And that might just help give you better overall behavior. You've also got to look at the cost of availability of bandwidth. You know, where do you live? Are really high performance network connections available to you? If not, well, then there might not be too much you can do. Or you might be prepared, or your employer might be prepared to pay for, you know, high performance mobile data or even SATCOM, high performance links. I have known that happen. Depends what it is you're doing and where you live and what you need to be doing and things like that. So what's available where you live is a bit of a trade-off. And again, this doesn't, if you think about it, it makes sense. We were trying to, because my mother had died, we were trying to sell the house in Edinburgh. You know, my father had died before that. And one of the important questions that several people asked first when trying to looking at the house was, have you got high-speed broadband going past the front door? You know, do BT or Virgin Media, are they in your street? Fortunately, the answer was yes. So much so that the people who ended up buying the house actually wanted to be able to send their chosen broadband supplier round several days before they moved in, you know, before we'd completed the sale, to dig the cable into the garden, because you know, clearly my parents didn't need high performance broadband and didn't have it. But they actually wanted to be able to do that and, you know, drill the wall and install the stuff ready for them moving in, so that when they moved in on, you know, being Scotland, you know, you move in on a Friday, you've got the weekend to get things squared up. He was working from home on the Monday and he wanted high performance broadband ready for the Monday. So that's an example of how times have changed. So yes, we went along with it and let them do that. So there's lots of things about what's available. And then the other question is, where are the systems you're connecting to? I know a lot of companies these days put things in the cloud, but not every company does. And the guts of what you need to connect to as a VPN server are probably within the company. And that's important to know too, because you may have all sorts of bandwidth issues and latency issues if you've got to go very long ways. It's a bit like one of the businesses I've been involved in for years, which is designing and building very high performance computer systems that span multiple data centers. One of the things we really have to worry about is distance latency between data centers, because that affects data replication performance and the rate at which we can keep the databases updated. So how far apart are your data centers, or how far apart are you from where you need to get to, is actually a really important design decision sometimes. And then this is the other side of it. You know, this is what's acceptable, because it does affect the perception of the organization. You know, I said earlier, we'd had some terrible voice calls with various finance companies of late. Some of them, no problem at all. Some of them, it's really poor. And that means it makes it difficult to hear people, and it's very frustrating. And it does make you think differently about the organization you're dealing with. It's also difficult for the people working from home to collaborate with their colleagues. You know, there's nobody they can ask for help. It's difficult to see if anybody's struggling. And that affects the quality of the response the end customer gets when they call up and they're looking for information. You know, I've been trying to turn on some small pension schemes, having just hit 65. And it's been really interesting how some of the organizations you deal with cope with this stuff really well. And some of them cope with it not terribly well at all. But it really makes a big difference to the perception of how the organization is. And then the other thing is figuring out where some of the problems are. And the awful thing about performance related, and this is true for really big systems, and I've ended up getting tangled up in some really complicated problems sometimes. Performance problems are the worst of all because they're usually transient. They're usually difficult to reproduce because they're terribly based on a whole load of circumstances. And there's usually no one single cause. There's usually a whole load of causes and effects. But there's usually a few common underlying things. So here, it boils down to, have you got enough bandwidth and what's the latency like? And is the latency changing a lot over time? Technically, we call that jitter, by the way. Mathematically, it's diff latency, so variation of latency with respect to time, but that's way too complicated. But understanding that things behave differently is really important. The other difficult thing about technology at home is it's usually built to a price, and it therefore doesn't have much in the way of monitoring and information logging. So you're reliant on digging through something if you can find it in Windows or Apple Macs, which are, of course, designed to be terribly user-friendly and therefore difficult to get this kind of information out of. And that's where knowing people or having a good IT support at work is really important, because after a while you can come up with some idea of what's going on. But ideally, for working from home, you'd have slightly better stuff with a bit of management and monitoring capability, and that would really help figure out what's happening where. Contention is usually the biggie. Bandwidth, you've not got that much. This is one of the things that you really walk into a lot. And as I've said earlier, sharing your Wi-Fi and interconnection with others, even if you don't know you're doing it, that will create contention. And all of these sorts of things will help. So I guess the advice is think of it as some kind of background noise, so do what you can to minimize them. Here I am doing a talk from an office at home. So what have I done? I've turned my phones off. I've put my cell phone on silent. I've shut the door. I've made sure that, I'm on the top floor, so other people are on somewhere else. And that way there isn't too much background noise. And I don't have any other bits of computer gear running at the moment. I've turned my laptop off, so it's not going to do an automatic update. I've killed off the automatic update things on my desktop PC, which I'm using. Things like that. So with a bit of thought, you can maximize the chance of things holding together fairly well. Another aspect that's worth considering about is security. And we saw this, it hit the news in a big way recently with the pipeline thing in North America. And there was a reasonably well-written article about that. I can't remember what it was. But one of the things that really jumped out at me was that with people working from home, it is so much easier to attack a big organization than it used to be. Or indeed the home worker. So if you're working in something that's generally very secure, you just might want to think a bit more about how secure things are. If you've got a PC at home and you connect via VPN using the same PC, and the PC at home gets attacked by something, and it then joins up with the work network, it can then cross-infect stuff. So you want to think hard about how you're doing this. You want to make sure that all your antivirus stuff and everything else is up to date. And this is one of the things that a lot of people in work will be worrying about. It's why a lot of companies will provide a dedicated laptop, for example, with a lockdown configuration, all those good things. And it's terribly easy, isn't it? You're working late, you've had a couple of drinks, you've relaxed, you're not really on your guard, and oh dear, you've just made a horrible mistake and something awful happens. And then it spreads. So do just think about it a bit more than maybe you would if it was just a machine at home. And the same goes for, homeschooling, all those other bits of advice. It's all the same kind of problem. And responsibility. You're no longer in the office. You're working from home. It's your own kit. It's all very blurred, isn't it? And who's paying for the necessary level of service? You could potentially make a reasonable argument that for working from home in a reasonably serious environment, that it would be kind of nice if work provided good connections and decent equipment and maybe a nice office chair and maybe a decent screen and, you know, all those sorts of things. Because you didn't particularly choose to work from home. It's happened. I know that, you know, prior to the pandemic, there were big companies, you know, Hewlett-Packard came to mind. Yeah, lots of people, they were shutting offices to reduce costs. People were working from home. And most people ended up with a reasonable setup of an office at home. I've chosen to work from home because I've run my own business for 20 odd years. So people who are finding themselves working from home because of the pandemic and are now well and truly into it and adapting, and the companies they work for are adapting, I think some of these questions are now starting to surface and become worthy of serious attention. I don't know what the answers are, and I think it depends very much on the kind of business it is, the need for security, the need for performance, the need for privacy, all of those other things. But they're questions that are probably worth considering. And slightly different subject matter. Now that you're working from home, do be careful about things like email. It's terribly easy to do stuff late at night. All of these apply to email at work, but it's just a bit more so when you're at home, you're off guard, you're a bit more relaxed, not quite paying attention. Things can go wrong more easily with consequences. The same for web access. You know, how would you restrict what people can look at? One of the things that bothers me a bit is kids doing homework on the net. I've had quite a lot of conversations with one of my brothers and his wife and their children about this kind of stuff. If you don't know anything about the subject, the first thing you come across might be quite plausible, but anybody can self-publish these days, and what you read, you know, unless you know enough about the subject, you don't really know whether it's well written, not so well written, or on occasions, downright lunatic. You know, go back to the days of books. In order that a book got published, it had to go through some reasonable, you know, process of review, etc., before it got published. So generally, it was okay. But with the rise of self-publishing, a lot of that's disappeared. So you might just want to think slightly carefully about letting kids do homework research on certain subjects, because they might just find things that you perhaps didn't want them to find, or that they latch onto and believe, and then you spend quite a lot of time fixing the erroneous information. And again, be really vigilant about your security. Yeah, there's been a massive rise in online banking and shopping. That's worth thinking about. Do think about things like the firewall software, and maybe even think about getting a better firewall router than the free one that came from your internet service provider. You know, a lot of the ones that will come from BT and Virgin Media can be put into what they call modem only mode, and you can then have a better firewall router behind that with maybe a subscription to web filtering and things. That's what I do. I happen to use one made by a company called FortiGate because I've used their big stuff a lot professionally. And I personally think it's very good. It's not the kind of thing that most people at home would have because they aren't terribly low budget, but they're very good. There are plenty of other makes out there as well that are worth thinking about if you think that's relevant. This is probably the most important thing. You know, we've all experienced this. You know, if something goes horribly wrong, it gets really stressful, you're short of time, it's awful. And with a bit of luck, your employer will provide plenty of support and assistance. That's terrific. And if you're on your own, running your own business, well, you really do need to know people who can help you when you need help, as you would with any other thing, you know, be it legal or financial or whatever. So knowing people you can call on for help is really important. Equally, it is also really important that you help others when they need it. So that's probably the most useful slide here. This brings us pretty much to the end. So all of these things that are going on for working from home successfully, there's a lot more to it than would appear on the surface. And providing really good voice and video requires quite a lot of investment. Troubleshooting and resolution requires really good information, and you aren't alone. So knowing people who can help you when you need it is really important. And that, I think, brings us to the end. So I hope you found that useful.
Thank you, Colin. It's Keith again here. Thank you very much for an extremely useful and interesting presentation. So as a reminder to everyone, if you have questions relating to this evening's webinar, please type them now and my co-host Jeff Hunt will address them. You can use the Q&A option in your control panel to do that. If you see that your question's already been asked, then you can use the upvote option to flag your interest in this topic. So I'd now like to hand over to Jeff to address the questions that you have raised. Jeff.
Thank you, Keith. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks again to Colin. Our first question actually comes from our Wiltshire Branch chairman, John Cooper, and he asks, do we think working from home promotes older workers being useful for more years?
Oh, good Lord. It might do. Yeah, you know, it might let them do things and help others without the stress and strains of travel.
Hopefully that answers John's question. For myself, just thinking about what you said, do you think that the move to home working, which will inevitably follow on from the pandemic, means that service and equipment providers will be forced to change their offerings to try and steal a commercial march on the competition?
When you say service and equipment providers, do you mean provided as things like laptops and broadband and so on?
Well, broadband providers and the folks who provide the hardware that sits at the end of the broadband. I mean, you've mentioned the asynchronous nature of broadband.
Sorry, asymmetric, yeah.
Well, asymmetric.
I used the wrong word to start with, sorry.
I was trying not to embarrass you.
That's all right. I'm quite good at doing it for myself, thank you.
Yeah, me too. But yeah, what can be done about that sort of thing, do you think?
I don't know about you, but where we live, I've noticed quite a lot more open reach vans. I mean, I know they're trying to put in, you know, fibre to the premises and stuff, and Virgin Media vans running around. I think they are going to improve somewhat. I also think it might lead to an improvement in some of the equipment and its reliability, which would be nice. A lot of the things that you get, don't forget, are remotely managed anyway. You know, they'll feed firmware updates and things to them in the middle of the night when you're not looking.
A question from Paul. What's your experience of Wi-Fi channel contention for those in compact environments with multiple residences? I guess blocks of flats and what have you.
Yeah, well, that's not dissimilar to setting up good Wi-Fi in a hotel or in a lot of a busy office building. Basically, you just need lots of access points, and there are, with the better Wi-Fi access points, means of controlling things like channel contention and so on. With a large number of domestic ones, it's a bit patchy, it's a bit difficult. If you're in a small building, you might want to think about having your own access point rather than using the one that comes in the hub, and because that'll give you more controls over some of the behavior. Or you just get one that's radiates far more power. But yeah, it's an interesting problem, particularly given the prevalence of Wi-Fi. And this is why my preference in general is wire, because it's immune from all of the above problems.
Question from Keith. With so many links between a work network and a home PC, are there any tools or techniques that could be used to determine any point in the chain that is failing or performing inadequately? And Keith asked this question as somebody who's seen his port replaced twice in the last year in the street junction box.
Yes. Once it goes outside the house, you're in the hands of the ISPs, really. You can all you can really do is run a sort of speed test every so often and say, well, at the moment I'm getting terrible performance or terrible latency or minimal bandwidth or whatever. Within the building, you can do slightly more, provided let's say you're running software firewall on a PC, you can usually go digging off into the advanced settings and find all sorts of things. But this is where you need to know people who can perhaps help you doing it. So going back to the question that you asked earlier, Jeff, one of the things I do think needs to be dealt with is providing better remote support to people working from home and helping them figure out what's gone wrong. But of course, all the remote support in the world is no good if their link's gone, right? Because you're then going to have to do that by phone.
Rather leads into a question from Clara, which was, how do we identify a good home support tech company?
Can they explain things? It's like anything else, I think. Can they explain things clearly to you in terms that you understand, that make sense, and that don't sound like they're making it up? And that's quite difficult. There's lots of businesses probably coming into existence. I'd probably look for somebody older rather than younger. I would probably look for somebody with a background in this kind of thing who can explain it clearly. But for me, the usual litmus test is, can somebody explain something to me clearly and simply such that I can understand it and sort of go, oh yeah, now I get it. So if they can do things like that, that's probably a pretty good start.
Question from Russell, which follows on from your points on security. Do you think the security of domestic broadband and Wi-Fi connections has generally been given enough focus by organisations in response to this massive and almost overnight migration to home working? I.e., are there risks and basic measures to mitigate them commonly addressed or even understood?
I fear that it hasn't been that well thought out, and lots of people are reliant on things like, we use a VPN because that's what everybody does to be secure. And if you go digging behind that, there's probably quite a lot of people thinking harder about it than they used to. But no, it does bother me that a lot of this stuff isn't quite as robust or secure as would be helpful. I think the people who are in businesses that really rely on it being secure have dealt with it appropriately, mostly. But a lot of smaller businesses and things probably haven't thought about it as much as they should do.
Question from Brian, which I can identify with where I live. What are your thoughts on satellite broadband? Does it have any advantages?
It's got horrible latency, but you can get good bandwidth. So it depends on what you're doing. If you're trying to do online meetings and stuff, it's probably not going to be that great. But if you're trying to do just download stuff, it's probably okay. There might be, other solutions. I mean, I know folks in various out of the way places, and there's been quite a thing in, I think it was part of Cumbria, B4RN, broadband rural networks, where farmers are digging the cables in, and then everything's being strung together with high-speed broadband. So there are alternatives. I got another friend recently who's been putting in high-performance, long-distance, line-of-sight Wi-Fi type links to try and bring bandwidth to wherever they are for working from home. But satellite stuff, yeah, it can work really well, but it does have different limitations because of the latencies.
Well, Colin, wait a minute. One question again from Paul. One of the issues I had staying with my existing supplier was the thought of a no connection land when switching providers. Is there anything that can be done to avoid this? What
I've done is use my cell phone as a hotspot. So if you switch providers and they're not giving you anything for a couple of days while the switchover happens, using the hotspot off your cell phone is probably adequate. Or now that the doors are open, you can probably go and visit a coffee bar, and all the sorts of things that we used to do for mobile working are still valid and would provide you a workable alternative. Or just go and be nice to one of the neighbours or something. So yeah, I understand the fear, but there are ways past it.
And another question from Clara addressed to you and indeed probably all the panelists. But does anyone know of any legal cases where employees have been challenged as a result when things go wrong, when they've been using their own equipment? I know terms and conditions are being rewritten for home workers.
Oh, that's an interesting one, isn't it? No, I don't know of anything like that, but boy, is that a minefield. Weren't we planning doing something around the legal and health and safety and so on aspects of home working somewhere in the next month or two?
Yes. I'll be sending out details of that fairly shortly. Yeah.
So yeah, that would be something worth putting on, I think.
Well, I think at that point we've exhausted the questions. So thank you, Colin, and I'll hand back to Keith.
So thanks to both Colin and Jeff, and thank you everyone for some great questions there. If you have anything else in terms of questions that we're unable to answer, please contact Colin, Jeff, or me directly. We'll do our best to respond. So on behalf of the BCS Wiltshire Branch, thank you for attending today's session. Have a great rest of your evening, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our future events. Goodbye for now.
Thank you all.